In last several months, we have seen a major reset in India-Canada relationship. The Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi was in Canada last year. It was followed by the big visit of the Canadian Prime Minister to India this year. Lots to unpack. With me is His Excellency, the Canadian High Commissioner to India. Your Excellency, welcome to WION, and lots to discuss, talk and have conversation. I'll begin with your visit to Canada. You just came from Canada. You had several meetings there. How do you see the relationship going and how do you characterize the relationship, and obviously about your going back to your country and having conversations there?
Thanks. Well, it's a great moment in our relationship. And I was back in Canada, as you mentioned. I was there for about 2 weeks. I crossed the country. I was all the way from Victoria in the west to Toronto in the east. And everywhere I met groups of business people, universities, political leaders. There's a lot of excitement about this relationship now. I mean, we've made at least a 180 turn from where we were just over a year ago, when Prime Minister Carney, as you know, invited Prime Minister Modi to the Kananaskis G7 summit. I think since then, the relationship has just gone from one success to another. But you could feel that spirit across Canada. A lot of interest on how we keep up this momentum. The different sectors, education sector, mining, energy. The Prime Minister himself, we met with a couple of times when I was in Ottawa. You know, he's very clear on what he wants to do. He wants to move forward on a pragmatic but principled basis with India, which he sees as a breakout country. I mean, your economic growth is unparalleled in the world for a large country, and we are also making changes in Canada that fit exactly into where India is going. In fact, the two economies are complementary. A lot of people said that to me as I traveled across Canada. So overall, I would say it's probably never been as good a moment for doing business and just for the overall relationship as we have now.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned about several aspects, including economy. I'll break down the various aspects, but let me start with economy because we had the big visit of the Indian Trade Minister, who was there for almost a week-long visit. We almost used to wake up with a lot of inputs coming from Canada. Now, how do you see the trading relationship and especially the SEPA trade agreement? There are negotiations which are underway. Any deadline, timeline you're looking at to conclude that?
Yes, well, first I wanted to just come back to Minister Goyal's visit. It was not only a big visit, a big trade delegation. Apparently it was the largest visit by any Indian trade delegation anywhere in the world. So we were delighted to host him and all of the business delegates. Already we're starting to see some deals come out of that. We do have some targets ahead. The two prime ministers agreed that this year we would conclude the free trade agreement, which we're calling the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or CEPA. We also have a deadline of doubling trade by 2030, which the CEPA will, of course, help to push forward. So we're pretty ambitious. But there's a lot, as I said, a lot of interest. And I think you'll also see later this year a reciprocal visit by our trade minister. We haven't announced that yet, but that's what we're discussing. And it will be at least as large as the one that Minister Goyal led to Canada. So lots of action happening there to build that economic relationship.
Mm-hmm. So this year, possibly we see the signing of the SEPA trade agreement, December,
I am
October?
I am confident we will see that signing occur. You've signed a number of agreements with other major trading partners like the EU, like the UK. We have, relative to them, a smaller trading relationship. So I think it's doable. I think both sides, particularly at the Prime Minister's level and at the level of the trade ministers and the chief negotiators who've now met a number of times, I think there's a commitment across the board. So I think they're going to find the way, and I'm pretty confident this will happen in 2026.
Mm-hmm. You also mentioned a very specific term, complementary economies between India and Canada. Any specific areas that you think so where cooperation can be firmed up? Pharma, AI, agriculture, any specific areas that you can tell to our viewers?
Yeah, well, as I said, this is a very special moment. It's partly because we have each come to a realization that we have these economies that are almost like gears, if you think of it that way. They're coming together like this, and I think once they fit, they're going to propel each other forward. You have enormous demand at scale, the largest population in the world. Your energy growth, for example, you'll take 35% of all the energy growth in the world over the next few years. You're buying 2,000 aircraft. AI is booming. You need critical minerals for the transition to a green economy, for defense, et cetera. Meanwhile, in Canada, we are building up our capacity across the board on energy, on critical minerals, on AI, advanced manufacturing. It just so happens that those two economies, and they're both big economies. Our economy, although we have a much smaller population, we are the largest, second largest country by land area. And in many areas we're a superpower. Say in energy, we have the fourth largest oil reserves, the fifth natural gas. We're one of the top 2 or 3 in AI research. So they just happen to fit together. Your demand fits exactly what we're building up in the capacities we have in critical minerals, in human resources, and natural resources. Not only that, but this is something that I learned while I was in Canada, the infrastructure, which before was largely north-south, because our biggest customer, our biggest market was the US. We're building an infrastructure that will allow us to reach Asia, and particularly India, much, much more easily, and that's coming up fast. So we will have about 1 million barrels a day of oil that we'll be able to pipe out our new pipeline to the West Coast. The same thing with LNG, the same thing with LPG. Now, because of the Gulf War, your demand or your, I guess, concern not to have so few sources of supply has actually accelerated. And that puts Canada and India in an even better position. We should be reliable partners for each other. We should integrate our supply chains, and we can rely on that partnership in future. So we have resilience when there's crises like these, but even in normal times. So it's pretty interesting that at this time, we've got demand on the one side, capacity on the Canadian side, and they're coming together very well.
You've made a significant point. I was coming to that point, how West Asia is shaping the energy supply chains, and Canada has played an important role. I recently saw a statement by the Indian government which confirmed that India is buying energy from Canada. Any details on that, how you providing India energy amidst this West Asia crisis?
Well, as I said, we are already an energy superpower in our own right. The difference today is that we're moving from being a provider of energy to the United States to a provider of energy to Asia, to Europe, and particularly India. So you mentioned, I think, or you were referring to the uranium deal, the Cameco deal, which was announced during the Prime Minister's visit. But we've also looked at oil, and I think we've begun to sell some oil. We are very close on other areas like LNG and LPG, but we also have a suite of green energy sources as well. We're very advanced in carbon capture, for example. We're building batteries for EVs in Canada. Now, many of these areas we haven't yet touched, but we are talking about that. So right now, we're looking at hydrocarbons. Because of the Gulf War, the urgency to help India get secure sources of supply there has grown. But we are looking at a wider suite of energy sources because you're moving very quickly to the green transition, so are we. And so we want to have that partnership across the board in all fields of energy.
Uranium deal is something that is seen as the biggest outcome from Prime Minister Carney's India visit. Any nitty-gritties about that deal in terms of when the export of uranium to India will start and what kind of conversation both sides are having? Because there was this announcement, but nitty-gritty is something that everyone would like to know.
Well, I was in Saskatchewan during my visit to Canada, and I was meeting with the head of Cameco, which is the company responsible for that, as well as the Premier, Chief Minister, if you like, of the province of Saskatchewan. Lots of excitement around this, but it's seen as only the beginning. It's a 10-year deal. I don't know exactly in what portion they will come per year, but we also have the technology around nuclear power. We, in fact, provided CANDU reactors over the years to India. Most of your nuclear fleet is based on our CANDU technology. You've moved on with that, and so have we. We've now got the first operational small modular reactor in Canada coming online. We've also got scaled down CANDU reactors that might also be very useful as your energy needs grow. So what we hope to have over the next few years, and this is referred to in the joint statement that the two prime ministers agreed to, is nuclear cooperation writ large. So the technology as well as the fuel, and we could be looking at all aspects of that, from engineering to heavy water, et cetera. So there's a lot happening in that space. I know you're going from 8 gigawatts to 100 gigawatts of nuclear power, and we want to be a very reliable source of both the materials, the raw materials, and the technology as we go forward. And we've adopted more nuclear technology ourselves, and that's why the skies over Toronto are nice and blue these days.
In fact, India has a new law, the Shanti law, that basically focus on more private participation as well with safeguards. Do you see this bill essentially enticing more Canadian companies to come when it comes to civil nuclear cooperation?
I do. We've not yet had, because things are developing so quickly in our relationship, we've not yet had the time to really sit down with industry in a coherent way and talk about that, but individually, Canadian representatives of the nuclear industry have spoken to me, and there's a lot of interest in this. It's a whole new field now, and we realize that we need to have nuclear power in order to reach those clean energy goals. So I think over the coming months, we'll start to see a more active discussion around that. But again, this is a partnership for us that stretches back to the 1950s. It's actually the one area of energy where we have worked together over the years. But it's fallen over over the last decade or so into a slower track. So we want to accelerate that. But I hope to be hearing more about that and from our industry and speaking with both government and industry on your side to see how we can make that go forward.
Education has been a historic pillar in the relationship. It has been growing, but it has had its issues as well with the Indian students facing their troubles in Canada. India had in the past issued advisory as well, but we have also seen positive elements. There was a big delegation of the universities head coming to Delhi and having conversation. Where does this education pillar stand, and do you see the fact that more Indians are preferring not US and preferring other countries to go because of what's happening in US immigration policies an advantage for Canada?
Well, at the risk of repeating myself, this is another area where we are kind of a superpower in education, not just in regards to India, but I think globally we're seen as a leader both in university education and in skills education. So you're right, we did have a very large delegation of our Canadian education leadership, colleges and universities. For us, colleges are what you would call polytechnics. We had 25 or 26 of our university presidents here, including all the famous universities, the big research institutions like UBC and University of Toronto, McGill University, as well as the leadership of the colleges. And this is a really interesting and good news story. So in the last couple of years, the story has gone a little bit sour because we did impose caps on the number of students, in part because there were people taking advantage of that system. And there were also people who were, for the students coming to Canada, they were making it, turning it from a good experience to a bad experience, with housing, for example, colleges that weren't really qualified to teach. We're turning that around. And what we're looking at, and what the colleges and universities are looking at, is something quite different. So on the one hand, yes, the students are welcome in Canada. Right now we host 400,000 Indian students. That's more than the EU, the UK, and Australia combined. That's more than the United States. And Prime Minister Carney was very proud to say that several times during his visit. So we want the students to come to Canada. But at the same time, our universities and colleges want to do something quite new. And this in part is an answer to a request from Prime Minister Modi. He said he would like to see institutions be in India. So that's what they're working on right now. While they were here with the Prime Minister in early March, they announced something we call the Canada-India Talent and Innovation Strategy. And the idea there is to come into India in different ways. Some universities may open a campus, and McGill is going to do that for AI. Others may open programs here. There could be joint degrees. There could be faculty exchanges, undergraduate and graduate students going back and forth. But all of that will add up to a presence in India. Now that's going to be more cost effective for students here and researchers, as well as for parents, of course. It's also going to lead to a tighter partnership. We don't want the relationship simply to be in one direction anymore. We want this to be a two-way relationship, reflecting the changes in both countries. So down the road, we would see a much more equal kind of relationship where we have Canadians coming here, there are research partnerships. We're all supporting industry in different ways. And that's one thing that I did hear a lot about in Canada. We need to look at the human resource dimension of that, and India and Canada should work together on that. You see many Canadian firms actually have Indian employees, about 100,000 Indians work for Canadian companies. In Canada, about 50,000 Canadians work for Indian companies. Well, what those companies are telling us is we'd like to have a talent pipeline, a corridor, in which people can go from Canada to India or from India to Canada as required by industry. So the education and skills development part of that should support that. And I think that's what both governments and both countries are looking for. So we're at the early stages. I'm in regular contact with the universities and colleges about how we develop this. This will probably take a few months and years to fully flesh out, but it's entirely new. It's different from what any other country is doing with India, and I think it will stand us in very good stead over the next few years. I would say as well that the 400,000 students, which we are proud to host, we've never really thought about it beyond them being students. But think about this. They're in their early years. They're in their 20s typically. We began to have large numbers of Indian students just a few years ago. Now, in 10 years' time, you've maybe got 10 times 400,000, 4 million students who've been to Canada. They've hopefully had a great experience. Most have gone home. We need to think about that as a resource in building the ties between the countries. That could be in business. Maybe there's ways of supporting that linkage. So we just need to start thinking about that because it's unique in the world. There's no relationship of education that's as large as that. And it's a people-to-people tie, but it could also be a business-to-business tie that we need to think about developing.
So clearly a lot of pillars to the relationship, energy, education, but the relationship also has a lot of baggages as well, and we have seen that in the past. Before the reset, we saw the relationship having a lot of troubles. Now, this year, we saw an important visit by the Indian NSA, and there were big announcements on counter-terrorism, on security cooperation. Both sides announced that they will come up with a mechanism as well. So in terms of the security cooperation, because both sides have their own concerns at the end of the day, how both sides are able to find convergences and make sure that in future, if there is a crisis, they can manage?
So I think this is another one of the successes within the larger success, and it's a foundational issue. It is why the relationship got off the rails, prior to Prime Minister Carney coming in. So the most important thing that's happened is the reestablishment of trust. So you mentioned a security delegation at senior level came to India. That was in September, actually the first week that I was here in September. Subsequent to that, there was your NSA went to Canada. The agencies involved have now been in regular touch. They have a dialogue, and they've established an official dialogue, but beyond that, they are in regular touch between the agencies. And we're starting to see real progress there. But all of that adds up to the establishment of trust. Now, both countries are, of course, concerned with the security and safety of their own citizens. And we're reminded of that because we have the anniversary of the tragedy of the Air India bombing back in 1985 coming up in just a week's time, and we'll actually be commemorating that here at the official residence. But I think what we're doing now is we are building a mature and effective relationship between the two countries, between the security agencies, so that we are cooperating to avoid problems in future. We've also taken a number of steps in Canada with respect to extortion, money laundering. We've set up a financial crimes commission. We've declared the Bishnoi gang as a terrorist organization. Arrests are occurring. There are things going on that you don't see publicly and that I can't talk about as well, but all that's adding up to greater security for both Canadians and for Indians, and is really building that level of trust on which all the other parts of the relationship can rest.
So you made an important point saying that they have been meeting regularly, meeting in terms of in-person, virtually, and you also said that there have been a lot of successes. I mean, I know that there are certain constraints and you can't divulge many things, but if you can define successes in terms of security cooperation, that is something that everyone would like to know.
Well, success is in that, each side had its own procedures. Some of these things were simply bureaucratic. We did it a certain way, you did it another way. So when we talk about border procedures, making sure that the borders are secure, that kind of thing. So that's something that is mundane perhaps, but very important when it comes down to the particular cases. They're reviewing their procedures regularly between each other, exchanging that kind of information. So this is leading to better outcomes for both countries. I can't go into the details about that, but in all areas, we try to avoid surprises. We are, if we see something coming up, the other side is saying, hey, look, this is coming up. Can we address this problem? Let's not take it to the public and make it a political issue. Let's deal with it in a mature way. And I think that's very much the attitude of the Carney government, which is pragmatic but principled, but I think as well of yours.
Another thing is the issue of Khalistani extremism. In fact, just last week we saw protests, we saw similar commentary that we have seen in the past, and many of these groups have been making hateful speeches, especially when it comes to former Indian prime ministers. India has been saying that these are criminals, and many of them, India says, need to be extradited as well. So how is this issue being dealt with, especially it being a big concern for New Delhi?
Well, we're both democracies. We know that that means people will say things that some of us don't agree with. Sometimes, they're awful, but they're also lawful. In this case, there are people who who adopt positions, who take public positions that none of us, I think, would agree with. Where there's criminal activity, as I said, we are taking steps. I think it's with renewed vigor to look at things like extortion, to look at money laundering. There was a report tabled by CSIS a few weeks ago. They do an annual report. They report to Parliament. And they noted that, within a democracy, there will be voices, people saying things that an average person doesn't agree with. But as long as it doesn't cross that line of criminality, that's within the rules. However, there was a recognition that there are some people who are extremists and who do go beyond the rules. And I think there was a fresh recognition there that some of those, we're taking a more serious look at. So I think we're coming closer to a convergence in how we see that problem. But in no way does Canada back groups that are extremists or that are criminal, and we are acting against those.
I think it was the first time that a Canadian authority has acknowledged Khalistani extremists as a cause of concern.
Well, it's the first time it's been acknowledged in that parliamentary setting. I couldn't recall whether we've had a politician say it in the past or not, but there was a pretty explicit recognition there. So again, this reflects, I think, a convergence of our views.
Let's move on to a multilateral aspect of the relationship. In fact, last year, both the leaders met also on the sidelines of the G20 summit in South Africa and announced the India, Australia, Canada trilateral. It is something that is innovative as well. And in terms of the multilateral aspect, both countries will be present at the G7 and G7 outreach summit in France next week, and possible meeting between PM Carney and PM Modi can happen given the fact that they will be under the same roof. So in terms of multilateral aspect, how both countries are cooperating at a time when the rules-based order looks like completely falling apart?
Well, I'm glad you raised that, because there's a backdrop to a lot of how the bilateral relationship is developing, and that is encapsulated in our Prime Minister's speech at Davos a few months ago. And he talked about the threats to the rules-based multilateral system, whether that's the trading system, peace and security, posed by hegemons. He also put forward another proposition that those other countries, middle powers for the lack of a better word, I think, by the way, he didn't think of India as a middle power. You're something much bigger than a middle power, but we haven't got the right terminology yet. We'll get there. But those countries working together have enormous force. He repeated that last week when I met with him. He's talking about those countries have, if you add up their GDP, if you add up their military power, their research and development, in many ways they equal or even exceed the capabilities of the two largest powers. And if we work together, we can provide an alternative. It's not necessarily to be against anyone, it's simply that we can provide an alternative. So in that context, we have, as you said, we're doing an agreement with Australia and India around AI. So AI is something that we are hopeful will lead to a better future, but very conscious of the fact that there are some serious risks. The finance ministers, our finance minister among them, just met recently in a multilateral setting where they talked just about that. So that's something that we can work on together, and it's an urgent issue because AI is developing quickly. We've also, I think we'll be able to see more of you in the Indian Ocean as a dialogue member of the Indian Ocean Rim Association, which you were the chair of. So we're hoping for India's support for that, and I think that's forthcoming. We want to be more present in the Indo-Pacific area in all aspects. We've got a number of trade agreements in the region as well. We hope that we can work together on that. I think there's a lot of thinking that will go on between our two countries about how we go forward. That might involve some of our think tanks and universities describing and thinking about what the future should be to make sure it's inclusive. I mean, India is also a leader of the Global South. We have to make sure the Global South has a greater voice. I think that's obvious to everyone. How we do it? In a way that, again, respects the rules-based international system and provides for effective outcomes. We haven't got the answers to all that yet, but that's something that we've got to talk about. And again, because we are, we share some history. We're Commonwealth countries, we are democracies, we're federal systems, we're kind of natural partners to look at the multilateral realm and say, well, these are practices that have worked for us. Maybe they can work in a multilateral setting that's changed a lot since it was set up after World War II.
So you mentioned about Indo-Pacific. When it comes to Indo-Pacific and the Indian Ocean region, it has seen a lot of developments. This is one of the most important areas of the world as well. Are you looking at defense cooperation with India as well? Because when it comes to defense cooperation, India has been speaking to many countries, including, I believe, with Canada as well.
Absolutely. And again, in the joint statement between the two prime ministers, you'll see mention of cooperation in that area. We just had a very successful visit of your National Defence College to Canada. They met with military counterparts, but they also met with the defence industry in Canada. Now, we plan to scale up very rapidly on defence, in part to meet our NATO commitments, but also because in defence, as in many other fields, Canada wants to stand more clearly on its own 2 feet and protect its sovereignty. So we'll be spending $500 billion more on defence by 2035. And bear in mind, when we're going to a 5% of our GDP target, and keep in mind that we are still the 9th largest economy in the world. So when you talk about 5% of the 9th largest economy in the world, that's a lot of spend. So we'll be heading into discussions with you, I hope very soon, on defense. We will be looking at the commercial side of that, procurement and so forth. We'll certainly have more discussions at the military to military level. It's an area where we've done very little in the past. So we've got lots of headroom to grow. And there's a big future, lots of interest by industry in India and in Canada, and I picked up a lot of that when I was on my visit. So this is something that we're quite excited about, and I think there's a great future in that field.
So my last question to you, how do you see the future outlook? You've mentioned about almost every aspect, including a defense cooperation, which is, I think, a novel element in India-Canada relationship, where defense has been very negligible. But how do you see the future of this relationship?
Do we have 2 hours? I guess not, because I could talk for 2 hours about that. There's so many fields where we are surprisingly modest in what we've done so far. Think of the auto sector. So you've got a very rapidly growing auto sector. On the other hand, Canada has just started to produce batteries for EVs. We'll be producing about 1.8 million batteries by 2028. So can we find some kind of a marriage in the auto sector? Defense, we talked about. Aerospace, you're buying 2,000 aircraft. Well, we produce many kinds of aircraft in Canada. We're one of the large country. We've always had a very large aircraft sector. Again, we've done very, very little in that area. Agriculture. Right now, we sell you a few things, pulses, not much more than that. Agriculture is our fastest growing sector. And it's the fastest growing sector because we're applying technique and technology to protect the soil and have more fertility, so we produce more from the same area of land while using less fuel. We've got science that applies to it that really is changing the nature of agriculture. We'd like to discuss that with you, the science, the product, the processing. We've done very, very little on that. Tourism, we have virtually no Indian tourists in Canada. You're going to have 500 million air travelers by 2035. Maybe some of them would like to fly to Canada. Of course, people come for their children who are at school, but not on cruise ships. They don't tour Canada, that kind of thing. We could develop that sector. So I see our goal of doubling trade by 2030 as rather modest. I think we should be stretching out and having a much, much larger trading relationship. Investment is already substantial. There's about $108 billion of Canadian investment, almost all of that in infrastructure, real estate, life sciences. There's a new study out from your Confederation of Indian Industry indicating that your investment in Canada is also significant, gone to about $11 billion now. That could expand significantly as we integrate our value chains, our supply chains, so that we are much more reliable suppliers to each other. And then the people dimension. I think we've had a lot of students going back and forth. We have a large diaspora. It's 2 million strong in Canada. But we have not been as comprehensive as we could be. I think the whole of Canada should be coming to look at the whole of India. We do have a number of provinces represented here. In a few weeks' time, a Quebec minister will be here. That will be, I think, the 5th province, which has had either a premier or a minister come here over the last few months. We've had, by the way, more visits in the last 6 months than in the previous 20 years, as a signal of how important this relationship is becoming to Canada. But I see a much, much more intensive relationship in the next 3 to 5 years, and frankly stretching on to 2047, to Viksit Bharat, when you aim to be a fully developed country. We too are creating a new Canada. It's a Canada that will be much more sovereign. It'll be much more oriented to Asia and India in terms of its economic partnerships, its political partnerships. So we too, by 2047, or perhaps before then, will be a rather changed country. You can see that forming, and that was one of the big takeaways I saw on my visit to Canada. It's a new Canada, and it's a new India, and I think that's why it's going to be a great partnership.
You were right when you asked me, do we have 2 hours? Because this is a conversation that we can really stretch, because these are aspects which are generally not there, but growing substantively when it comes to this relationship. But thank you, High Commissioner Sir, for speaking to WION and explaining us where the relationship stands, the opportunity, the challenges, and of course the future outlook. Thank you so much.
Thank you.